Hello everybody, thanks for being here today. And special thanks to Rob for organizing this Vienna Vue.js meetup, that's how it's called. But me and my friends, we like to call it Vienna.js, that's why I have written on the slides today. I think you know what we mean by that. My talk will be split into two parts. On part one, I will cover the basic Vue.js features, and in part two, we'll have a look at the component-based architecture provided by Vue.js. So if you want to get started with Vue.js, let's ask the audience, have you already worked with Vue.js, and how advanced was your usage of the framework? So, who has already seen a Hello World? Okay, pretty much everyone. And who uses it in production? Not so many. Who created an app for private purposes or something like that? Okay, so there are some advanced users here, and are there some users here who call themselves beginners and want to know how to get started with Vue.js? Okay, so this talk is for you. I will really cover the basics of Vue.js and how you get started into app development by starting with this Hello World scene on the screen. So, and in this code, we can see the most important concept of Vue.js already, which is data binding. Vue takes data from our data object and binds it to our application. This is the most important feature of Vue.js, I would say. And like nobody else before, we have the idea of creating a to-do application. I think it's very original. And we do it almost live on stage. So, started from the Hello World we saw earlier, we create a to-do application, and we start by creating items and rendering them as a list. So this is another important feature of Vue.js. We can use v4 to render items in a list. Another thing we see here is event binding. So we can use key up enter to bind the enter key of the input field to our callback add item. And also we can use add click event on our button to bind it to our event. And we also have two-way binding from our input element to the variable new item, which means it doesn't already bind it from the application's data object to the view. It also binds it from the input element to our data object. So it's both directions. Why is it marked? Okay. If we run this application we see here, we get this. We get a list of items. We can add items, and it's almost like a to-do application. But actually, that's nice, but we also want to mark items as done. And we can do this by first adding a component, where is a component? Property done to our items, which we can use in the view. So if the item is done, we render it as strike, and if not, we render it normally. So this is another important concept, conditional rendering. We can use if-else inside the template. Yeah, I see you're bored. I think you already know the most important concepts. We can add items here, and it goes on. So now we get fancy and add some more advanced features. We can use style and class binding like this. So in this progress bar, we define the width of the bar by calculating how many items are already completed. And that's another interesting thing. We can use computed to dynamically calculate how many items are already completed. Computed progress, right? And if we look at this example, it's already more fancy. We can also use the checkbox to toggle the to-do state, and we can remove and add items dynamically. And I think you recognize the progress bar, which updates automatically. So these are the basic features of Vue.js. Let's sum it up. We have data binding. We have two-way data binding by the use of free model. We know how to render lists. And we know how to bind events by using add-click and add-keyup. And also we know about style and class to bind style and class properties to our DOM elements. So we started from a very basic Hello World application and built it into some kind of small application just by adding more and more features to it. But if we go on this way, it might end up into a big, huge pile of application with more spaghetti code. And so we should think about structuring our code. And this is where we go to part 2, where we have a look at the component-based architecture. If we take the code from our first example, we can split it into 3 parts: the CSS, the HTML, and the JavaScript. So by structuring our code, we could just put them into 3 separate files. It would be more structured than it is now into one file. But if we look at it differently, we could split it into a progress component, which was the bar we saw earlier. We could define a to-do item, which we render in a list. We could also pack the add item component, the input field and the button into one component. And we have an application around it that packs it all together. So if we visualize it on a tree, it could look like this. We have all small components. Starting from the app component, we have the progress, the do item, and add item in a tree-like structure, similar to the DOM as we know it. And the progress bar is just, its only purpose is displaying the progress bar. The to-do item displays and changes the to-do items, and the add item component is responsible for creating new items. And Vue.js offers us a very powerful feature by single file components. We can put any component or feature we want into one single file component. So what are they good for? We can create small and reusable components. We have the HTML and CSS and JavaScript of each component individually combined into one file. We also have scoped CSS, because in the other example we only had one global style sheet. And that's maybe a bad thing, but we need a compiler to pack it all together, which in other terms enables us to use ECMAScript 6, TypeScript, SCSS or others. So it can be good or bad. Let's have a look at file structure. We have a very small index HTML. We have an app.vue file, and our components are into separate .vue files. And we have a main.js file for the entry point for Webpack for our compiler, but you can also use another one. The index HTML file is very small. We just have a div container with the ID app and link the compiled JavaScript file. And in our main.js file, using ECMAScript 6, I only define a root instance of a Vue.js model, which loads the app.vue file. Okay, the screen is too small. Okay. In our app.vue file, we now get started by importing components. So the components we create get imported. We register them as components, so we can use them in the HTML like ordinary HTML tags. And now this gets more structured, because in our app we only have those 3 files, and it's much more smaller than what we saw before. And another important thing is, by using components, we need to pass down properties, which looks like this. So by passing down the items property, the progress bar can use the items in its own component. The to-do item looks as follows, and here we see how to define properties. As we saw before, the to-do item gets an item property, and by declaring it here, we can use it as it was in our own data property. So we can display the item in our template. Yeah. In the progress bar, we get the items, and we can calculate all the stuff as we did before, but now it's combined into one component and not in our root application. And we also get scoped CSS, which means by adding this keyword, the CSS styles we define here are only applied to the elements in this template. So if you have another class progress somewhere else in the application, the styles defined in here won't apply to them, which is very handy if you got common class names. You don't have to define unique ones. The new item component is very small and straightforward. Here we have our own data property for private data. So this data is only used by this component, which is handy in this place because this new item is mapped to the input field, and we use it to create a new item and reset the value afterwards. So this property isn't used somewhere else in the application. And we emit events. We can emit custom events, like this add item event in this case, to tell the parent component that this event occurred. And this is how components communicate with each other in a component-based architecture. The parents pass down properties, and the childs emit events. This is basically only from parent to direct child, but it works in the tree also. So data gets passed down, and events get emitted upwards. So in the talk, I told you that we are progressively advancing our application. And if we go back to the application code I showed earlier, we can spot a thing which is not that good in terms of component architecture, because we have already the list and the add items method in the app itself. So this could be packed into a component as well. So that's what we do. We could change our tree we saw earlier by adding another component, to-do list, which combines the to-do item and the add item component. And this method we can apply every time by our application, so it actually grows with us. The new app.view looks as follows. We only have the progress bar and the newly introduced to-do list component. And we remove the new items and the to-do items. And in the new to-do list component, we render the list and add the new items component. And the list manipulation is only handled by this component, and the rest of the application don't have to know about it, because the rest of the application doesn't have to care about it. So starting from our world Hello World application. We developed it into a small application, and now we further improved it into a structured component application. And that's how you can use Vue.js for component-based architecture. And we can incrementally improve our application as it goes with us. Thanks.